I told you, this can't get out. No one can know. The voice trembles, barely a whisper, but the urgency cuts through the static. Then, silence. A recorded prison call, abruptly terminated. Somewhere in the darkness, a fluorescent light hums. Faint, flickering. A badge lies discarded on the cold concrete floor. Stained. The number barely visible beneath the smears of something dark, something final. Inside Greywater Correctional Facility, the world continued as it always had, rows of cells, the clang of metal doors, the dull shuffle of worn boots on linoleum. But on the morning of March 3rd, something shifted. Darius Cole was found hanging in his cell. Suicide. That was the word passed down, stamped on the report, filed away before noon. Just another inmate. Just another statistic. But the story didn't end there. Because someone inside these walls knew the truth. Someone who understood that the dead don't always bury their secrets, and that some secrets are worth killing for. Tonight, we uncover what really happened in the final hours of Darius Cole's life. A forbidden relationship. A whispered accusation. And a cover-up that would send shockwaves far beyond the prison gates. Stay with me. This one doesn't end where you think it does. Greywater Correctional Facility. A name whispered in caution, written in reports, and stamped across the uniforms of those who called it home, whether they had a choice or not. It wasn't the worst prison in the country, but it carried its own kind of weight. The kind that settled in the walls, in the air, in the hollowed-out eyes of those who knew they weren't getting out. Inside Cell Block C, Darius Cole had learned how to survive. 15 years for armed robbery. No priors before that. No gang affiliations. No close friends. Just time, ticking away, in a place where time rarely did anyone favors. And then, on the morning of March 3rd, it was over. A sheet tied to the metal bed frame. A body, still, eyes open but empty. The report called it suicide. Case closed. But there was one problem. Darius Cole wasn't the kind of man to give up. For 7 years, Officer Vanessa Loring had built a reputation at Greywater. Fair. Professional. The kind of officer who kept her head down, did her job, and left. A rare thing in a place where control was currency and power meant survival. Then the rumors started. A whispered name passed between inmates. Glances that lasted too long. A note, found in a cell, written in careful, deliberate strokes. Nothing concrete. Nothing that could be proven. But in a prison like Greywater, rumors were just as dangerous as the truth. By the time the truth came out, one life had already been lost. But the real horror? The truth had been buried long before the body. And someone inside these walls had made sure of it. Stay with me. Because this story is far from over. Darius Cole's last day started like any other. A morning headcount, a tray of bland food, a few murmured conversations in the yard. To anyone watching, he was just another inmate waiting for time to pass. But those who listened closely, they heard something else. A shift in his voice. A tension in his steps. Cole wasn't acting like a man who had given up. At dinner, he barely touched his food. Spoke in low whispers to the few inmates he trusted. One of them would later recall the words he muttered under his breath, like a warning to himself. She's not gonna let this go. Not after what I know. But whatever he knew, he took it with him. Because by morning, Darius Cole was dead. According to prison logs, lockdown was called at 9 p.m. sharp. Officers completed their routine sweeps. Inmates settled into their cells. At 2:14 a.m., Vanessa Loring entered Cell Block C, alone. The security cameras caught her walking in, but here's where it gets strange. She never walked out. Not until 3:27 a.m., over an hour later. That night, there were no alarms, no emergency calls. Just silence. Then, at 7:32 a.m., officers made their rounds. Darius was found hanging from his bed frame. A bedsheet tied too neatly. His body positioned too carefully. The note left behind? A single sentence scrawled on a torn scrap of paper. "I couldn't live with what I've done." It was enough to close the case. A quick, easy suicide. But not everyone believed it. The bruising around his neck didn't match. The ligature marks weren't consistent with self-inflicted strangulation. And when a forensic analyst took a closer look at the note, the handwriting didn't match either. The case should have been reopened. Should have been investigated. Instead, Greywater Correctional Facility did what it did best. They buried it. No autopsy. No further questions. A simple suicide ruling, signed and filed before noon. Vanessa Loring submitted her report without hesitation. "I did my rounds. I saw nothing unusual. That should have been the end of it." But it wasn't. Because someone inside that prison wasn't ready to let this go. The warden arrived at his office that afternoon, his usual stack of papers waiting on his desk. But in the middle of it, a single folded letter with no name, no return address. Inside, just one sentence: "Check her call records. She's lying." And just like that, the case wasn't so closed anymore. The anonymous letter had done its job. Investigators were no longer looking at Darius Cole's death as a simple suicide. They were looking at Officer Vanessa Loring. The first red flag: the phone records. Between October and February, over 200 unauthorized calls had been made from Greywater Correctional Facility to a single burner phone. The number wasn't registered. No name. No history. But the calls all came from one extension, Loring's. For months, someone had been whispering on the other end of that line. And the last call. March 2nd. Hours before Cole was found dead. Then, another discovery. A prison nurse came forward with an unsettling detail. Darius had undergone HIV testing just 2 weeks before his death. A routine check. Maybe. But according to the nurse, it wasn't his idea. Officer Loring had insisted on it. And the result? Nowhere in the prison's official health logs. Someone had erased it. Inmates talk. Secrets never stay buried for long in a place like Greywater. When questioned, a handful of prisoners confirmed the rumors: Cole and Loring were involved. Not in passing. Not in whispers. This wasn't just a brief encounter. This was months in the making. But there was no proof, until they checked his cell. Buried beneath his mattress, folded into the thin prison-issued sheets, were letters. Dozens of them. Love notes, threats, desperation scribbled on scraps of paper. One stood out. "You said you'd protect me. But if I'm sick because of you, I'll make sure everyone knows." Cole had been afraid. And fear like that doesn't come from nowhere. Someone had something to lose. And someone had made sure he wouldn't talk. The missing test results. The erased records. The note hidden in his cell. None of it was coincidence. One nurse recalled something strange the night Cole died. A figure seen through the small glass window of the medical records office. Someone rifling through files. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. After all, corrections officers accessed medical logs all the time. But when she was shown a picture of Loring, her hands shook. "I didn't say anything before, but I know it was her." This changed everything. Had Loring learned something that night? Had she gone into those records to confirm Cole's results? And if so, what did she do next? The prison had been so quick to call it suicide. To shut down the case. But now, the weight of the evidence was pressing in. The bruises on his body. The faked handwriting. The missing test results. This wasn't just a tragic ending. It was a cover-up. And Officer Vanessa Loring was running out of places to hide. Everything was starting to collapse. For years, Vanessa Loring had been known as a model officer, calm, disciplined, unshaken by the pressure of Greywater's walls. But after Cole's death, something shifted. She started showing up late, one of her fellow guards recalled. She wouldn't look people in the eye. At first, no one questioned it. Everyone processes loss differently, even when it's an inmate. But then there were the little things. Shaking hands when signing paperwork. A sudden request for time off. The way she flinched whenever Cole's name was mentioned. She wasn't sleeping, another officer admitted. You could see it on her face. I caught her in the break room one night, just staring at the wall. Didn't even hear me walk in. And then, the biggest red flag. She volunteered for a polygraph. No one had asked her to. No one had even suggested she was a suspect. But she insisted, almost as if she needed to prove something to herself. The day of the test, she sat down, hooked up to the machine. The first few questions were routine. Name. Rank. Employment history. But when the examiner asked, "Did you have any involvement in Darius Cole's death?" Loring froze. Seconds passed. Then she reached for the wires, pulling them off herself. "I need to talk to a lawyer." She never returned to work after that. The truth was closing in, and she knew it. Forensic analysts had been combing through everything, records, surveillance, even Cole's supposed suicide note. And one by one, the cracks in her story were turning into gaping holes. First, the handwriting. Cole's note had been written with a standard prison-issued pen. Nothing unusual, until they compared it to Loring's personal logs. The loops, the slants, the way certain letters connected. A perfect match. Cole hadn't written that note. She had. Then, the security footage. When Cole's body was found at 7:32 a.m., the first thing officers did was check the cameras. The footage had shown Loring making her rounds, passing through his block around 2:14 a.m. But something didn't add up. A timestamp error. A missing fragment. It wasn't obvious at first, but when investigators ran a full scan of the digital logs, they found it. Exactly 22 minutes of footage, gone. Deleted from the system. And the only person with the clearance to do that? Officer Vanessa Loring. They didn't arrest her at the prison. They didn't need to. By then, she was already avoiding the place. Detectives picked her up at her home, late at night. No struggle. No resistance. Just a long, empty stare as they placed her in handcuffs. At first, she refused to talk. But hours later, after sitting in a cold interrogation room with no phone, no lawyer, no escape, she broke. He was going to ruin me. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. He said he'd tell my husband. My job, my life, everything would be gone. She had spent months sneaking calls to him, passing notes, crossing lines she never should have crossed. She had convinced herself it wasn't real, that it wasn't wrong, until Cole threatened to expose her. And then, something inside her snapped. She admitted to forging the note. To staging the scene. To making it look like a suicide. But she swore she hadn't killed him. He was already dead when I got there, she said, tears streaking her face. I just covered it up. But then came the final twist. When investigators finally recovered Cole's missing medical records, his test results had come back negative. He never had HIV. The entire motive, the panic, the fear, the desperate attempt to silence him, all based on a lie. The courtroom was packed. Press, former colleagues, families of inmates, everyone wanted to see how far she would fall. Vanessa Loring sat stiffly in the defendant's chair, her face blank. The same woman who once held power inside Greywater Prison was now shackled at the wrists, waiting for a decision that would decide the rest of her life. The prosecution didn't hold back. They painted her as a corrupt officer who abused her authority, who let her personal choices cloud her judgment, who covered up a crime she could have prevented. But the defense had their own story. She was manipulated, her attorney argued. Cole preyed on her vulnerabilities. She was terrified, desperate, acting out of fear, not malice. The jury didn't buy it. The verdict, guilty. Second-degree murder. 25 years. When the sentence was read, Loring barely reacted. No tears. No protest. Just a slow nod, as if she had been expecting it. But outside the courtroom, the world had plenty to say. News outlets ran headlines like, "Guard turned killer, the fall of Vanessa Loring." Online debates raged, was she a cold-blooded murderer, or just another victim of a system that blurred the lines between power and control? And inside Greywater, new policies rolled out overnight. Guards were now forbidden from having any unsupervised contact with inmates. All calls and medical records had to be double-checked. Strict barriers were put in place to prevent another Loring incident. But some whispered that it wasn't about fixing the system. It was about hiding the fact that Loring wasn't the first. And she wouldn't be the last. One question still haunted investigators. Who sent the letter? The anonymous tip, the note that exposed Loring's secret, that led detectives to her call logs, that ultimately cracked the case, that person was never found. They had risked everything to bring Loring down, but why? A fellow guard? An inmate? Someone else with a grudge? Detectives traced every possible lead, ran handwriting analysis, even checked the prison's visitor logs. Nothing. The author had vanished, leaving behind only a single sentence, "Check her call records." She's lying. Some believed it was a fellow officer, tired of the corruption. Others suspected an inmate, someone who wanted revenge. But one theory refused to fade. What if the letter came from inside Loring's own home? Her husband had never spoken to the press. Never attended the trial. Never made a statement. And when reporters knocked on his door, there was only one answer. No comment. Years passed. The world moved on. But inside Greywater's women's wing, Vanessa Loring sat alone. Her once pristine uniform was long gone, replaced by a prison-issued jumpsuit. She had become just another inmate, another case number, another forgotten name. But when a journalist finally managed to get a short interview with her, she only had 3 words. "I had no choice. No explanation. No regret. No plea for sympathy. Just that." Darius Cole died over a secret that never even existed. And in the end, the only person Officer Vanessa Loring truly destroyed, was herself. Loring's story was over. The verdict was final. But the questions? They never stopped. Would she have gotten away with it if not for that single, unsigned letter? Or was she doomed the moment she let herself believe she could control the outcome? Some say justice was served. Others believe there was more to the story, pieces still missing, names never spoken, secrets buried in places no one bothered to dig. And then there's the one thing no one can explain. Who sent the letter? A guard? A prisoner? Someone watching from the outside, waiting for the right moment to strike? Or was it someone even closer? Because one thing is certain, whoever wrote that note knew exactly what they were doing. And they never came forward. So tell me. What do you think? Would Loring have walked free without that letter? Or was she always on borrowed time? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's see how deep this goes. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe. Because tomorrow, we're looking at a case that makes this one look tame.